Hello guys, today we are going to be learning about how to use the Starfist weapon, the best weapon.
That's about enough of that. Hello everyone, this video is a comprehensive guide to crit fishing in Elden Ring. I'll be covering everything from the most important fundamental mechanics to understanding the technical inner workings of the game. Whether you like the big damage of a riposte, find satisfaction in outplaying your opponents and mastering game mechanics, or just want to get the most stylish and fancy clips possible, crit fishing applies in each of those scenarios, and I hope this video will provide you with the knowledge you require to improve. Crucially, I will cover not only how to get backstabs or crits, but also how to avoid being backstabbed or parried as well, and even counter another player who is trying to fish you. The main topics that I will cover in this video include what is fishing, how backstabs work, including how to get them and how to avoid them, the best weapon setups to use based on frame data and hitboxes, how parries work, including how to get them and how to avoid them, Wakeups, Guardbreaks, dealing with difficult to fish setups, and finally, advanced strategies or techniques, including counterfishing and mind games. What is fishing? Critical attack fishing, often shortened to crit fishing or simply fishing, refers to a playstyle that mainly focuses on getting critical attacks on your opponents. So this includes ripostes, backstabs, and grabs. Ripostes, of course, coming from parries and guard breaks. It is generally seen as a high-risk, high-reward strategy, but that isn't always the case. Fishing can also be a highly effective and even the most efficient approach, depending on the circumstances. So, even if your sole objective is to win a fight at all costs, recognizing opportunities to go for crits and knowing how to fish is still an important asset. As hilariously effective as mashing the L2 button often is, it will only get you so far. My point being, whatever your objective may be, even if it isn't becoming a full-time fisher-swapper, knowing how to fish will still be an important tool in your skill set. Fishing is all about forcing certain predictable actions from your opponent, and mind games or reads, and backstabs, often revolve around manipulating people's locked-on movement and attacks. With Elden Ring being out for a while now, and backstabs going through multiple different patch changes, and the DLC dropping, I figured it was finally time to release a fishing guide, something that I've been promising to do for a while now. Backstabs are an often misunderstood, or only partially understood game mechanic. I have seen a lot of incorrect information being spread around, and I would like to clarify that. So how do they actually work? To start, let's have a look at the backstab grab animation itself. The backstab grab animation has 6 frames of startup, with the grab box being present for 2 frames, on frames 6 and 7 at 30 FPS. Going forward throughout this video, all frame data I refer to will be at 30 FPS unless I state otherwise. So for everyone with a PS5 or a PC that can get 60 FPS, all of these values will be doubled. For example, at 60 FPS, the grab box will actually be present for 4 frames rather than 2. Same total duration of time, just more frames per second. Although many of you probably play at 60 FPS, the Elden Ring animation data standard is 30 frames per second. So as I said, all the frame data I refer to from this point forward will be at 30 frames per second. With that out of the way now, I'll reiterate, 6 frames of startup, with a 2-frame grab box on frames 6 and 7. So what exactly does that mean? This means that when you're behind another player and you press R1 to initiate a backstab, after that input is registered, there will be 6 frames of your character starting this animation and drawing their arm backwards before a cylinder-shaped grab box will appear in front of you. Assuming that your opponent is standing still, somewhere inside the grab box, your backstab will go through. Pretty simple, right? Well, there's a bit more to it, and this is where things get a bit more complicated, so stay with me. If you have some experience with PvP already, you're likely aware that a few conditions need to be met. If you initiate a backstab attempt and your opponent moves out of range of that cylinder-shaped grab box during your startup before it is present, then the backstab attempt will not go through. Additionally, there is also an added angle check, so that if your opponent turns too much before the grab box, then the backstab attempt will also fail, regardless of the fact that they may still be inside that grab box. This angle check was something new that they decided to add, building on their previous systems in Souls games. If you're interested in a bit more of history around this, although a bit dated now, I would recommend watching this video about the history of Soulsborne backstabs. Since the release of the game, the backstab angle check has been adjusted from 60 degrees to 120 degrees to 135 degrees, meaning that if your opponent turns more than 135 degrees towards you, either to the left or the right, then the backstab attempt will fail. With me so far? Important to note here is that all of this is happening on the defender's side. As an attacker, you can think of it as you're simply throwing out a request for a backstab, and the defender will receive those packets of information and show you performing a backstab grab. Then, if their game confirms that the necessary conditions are met, it will initiate and throw them into a backstab. A good way that we can demonstrate this is on high latency. Latency is an extremely important factor to consider for all aspects of fishing, and is something that I often see being overlooked when it comes to learning how to get backstabs or parries. We all have to deal with latency when playing PvP, and it is a skill to be able to adapt to different latencies, which is why I'll be addressing it throughout this video, so more on this later. For now, let's complete our understanding of how the backstab works. Using high latency, we can more easily see the separation of the request for a backstab, followed by the confirmation or rejection. Let's see what this looks like. On the attacker screen, they walked up to me, initiated a backstab attempt, got through the startup, and had their grab box go off, all while I stayed perfectly still, yet the backstab still isn't going through. So what gives? Well, let's have a look from my perspective, and things might start to make a bit more sense. On my screen, I see the attacker walk up to me, and just as they reach me, I turn around to make sure I don't get backstabbed. So by the time my game has received the information that my opponent is starting a backstab, and the first 6 frames of startup have completed for me, I have now inputted to face my opponent, and therefore the angle check fails, and the backstab does not go through. Of course, my movement and actions are delayed due to the high latency between me and my opponent, so they do not see me turn around on their screen until roughly 395 milliseconds later. By that time, they are almost completely finished with the grab animation. So, to conclude, after a backstab is initiated by an attacker, the defender must not move out of range of the grab box before there has been the 6 frames of startup since the backstab grab is initiated, according to the defender's game, or turn more than 135 degrees, relative to the direction or position their game believes the backstab is being initiated from, for the backstab to be successful. I use this wording because movement and other actions in addition to latency can make for some weird results, since your opponent's movement will all be delayed as well. At this point, you may now be thinking that high latency must make getting backstabs way more difficult, which is somewhat true, but not always. More on this to come. One more thing that you may have noticed in that example clip is that it appears I may not have even turned more than 135 degrees by the time the grab box is going off, yet I still do not get thrown into a backstab. This is because the instant you input a movement direction, your character is actually already facing that direction as far as the game is concerned. The turning that we see is simply a smoothing animation that is played to make the movement look natural. One way that we can visualize this is by drawing the throw area behind our character, and you can see that as soon as the input to turn around is registered, this throw area flips perfectly to reflect the actual direction our character is currently facing, while it lets the rest of the turning animation play out. Finally, there is one other check that happens for a backstab grab request to even be sent out and have that cylindrical grab box become active, which is, by the time your backstab grab box is spawned, 6 frames of startup have gone by, the other player cannot be in iframes, or else your request for a backstab will not be sent. So you can see here that despite the fact that my opponent is clearly within range, inside the grab box, and not failing the angle check, they still do not get backstabbed, because on my screen, I had incorrect timing so that they were in iframes on my screen by the time my backstab grab box was spawned, and therefore no request is sent. Now that you hopefully have a good understanding of how backstabs work fundamentally, let's move on to the part I'm sure you are eagerly awaiting: how to actually get them. Backstabs can be broken down into different categories or types, and the first type I want to go over is the roll punish backstab. Within the roll punish backstab, there are several variations as well, but the general premise is to backstab a player who rolls unnecessarily or in a predictable manner. First, let's start with one of the most common backstabs and how to execute it with proper timing and movement. Getting backstabs consistently is all about optimal movement and positioning. Of course, good reads and predictions are also important, but there are many backstabs that can be done on reaction, and it will be virtually guaranteed for them to go through if you have proper positioning. One of these backstabs is done when a player rolls away from you while unlocked, and it is often referred to as the inescapable backstab. With acceptable latency and connection quality, this backstab is the most consistent and as close to guaranteed as possible, given that you execute with proper positioning and timing. So let's have a look and break it down. This is a type of backstab that has existed in essentially the same way since Dark Souls 3, but it was significantly more difficult to do, which is a good thing for learning and consistency in Elden Ring, but it does make it much less skillful and impressive to pull one off successfully, as your execution doesn't need to be anywhere near as precise in order to be rewarded with a backstab in this situation. To understand what has made this backstab easier, let's see what has changed in Elden Ring from Dark Souls 3. There are two main things that have changed which explain this. Firstly, the rolling distance in Elden Ring has been made shorter, and second, the cylindrical grab box has been made larger as well, so the effect is twofold. In Dark Souls 3, you pretty much needed perfect execution to get this backstab against someone who was spamming roll away, and there's something very satisfying about landing a backstab like this, with near perfect execution, and knowing there was absolutely nothing your opponent could have done to escape it once they made that initial mistake of rolling away. However, despite the lesser satisfaction, as I said, the greater consistency in Elden Ring is nice. So let's talk about this specific technique and positioning to execute this. This is where we can actually use Dark Souls 3 as a helpful tool to learn about how to do this backstab optimally, due to the increased difficulty, and it can be good for practicing as well. Alternatively, you can also practice in Elden Ring on high latency to test how good your positioning is. As you can see in this clip, we can visualize all the positions that you can potentially get a backstab grab from with this cone shape behind the other player. With this visualization, it should be pretty self-explanatory approximately where you would want to be in order to give yourself the best chance to get a backstab on another player. If you're thinking pretty much right behind them, then you'd be correct, because remember what needs to happen is for the other player to be inside our cylindrical grab box that appears in front of us when we initiate a backstab attempt in order for the backstab to go through. So logically, by standing right behind them, we are putting the other player as close to the center of that grab box as we can, meaning that they could still move a little to either side or forward, and they would still be inside it, resulting in a successful backstab. While this is true, this isn't always the location that you want to be going to in order to get a backstab. Why is this? Well, simply put, the answer is latency. Latency is quite complicated and sometimes difficult to understand or explain, which is why I think many people don't like to go into it or address it. However, I have made a promise to address it in this video, as I feel it's often overlooked despite the fact it has such a large impact on gameplay. When someone is rolling away from you, the most optimal positioning to get a backstab is actually right beside them, as remember, the higher the latency, the more delayed your position and actions are going to be. I think this is easiest to understand by simply seeing both perspectives. You can see here that despite the fact it may look like I am right beside the other player on my screen, I am still definitely behind them on my opponent's screen. This means that if I am to simply run directly behind my opponent, then my opponent will actually see a somewhat significant gap between myself and them on their screen. This isn't ideal because, especially on higher latency, by the time my backstab grab box appears, they will likely already be far enough ahead that they will not be inside it, and therefore the backstab grab will fail. Essentially, what we are doing by running beside the other player is compensating for the unavoidable latency that we all play on. Then here's where the timing comes in. The timing for when you want to press R1 to attempt the backstab is just as your opponent is landing from their roll, so that on low latency, we're basically grabbing them right out of their roll. We can watch a couple of examples back in slow motion so that you can see exactly when I am activating the grab. Now another key thing that you may have noticed at this point from the examples and analyzing this further is a small but important detail with the movement. You can see that again, to compensate for latency, I am actually clipping my character right into my opponent as I get ever so slightly in front of them on my screen, and then let their character complete their roll almost through my character as I am stopping to go for the backstab. This is what you want to look for as a sign of good timing and positioning, as I'm again trying to make sure that my character is as close to my opponent's back on their screen as I go for the backstab as possible, so that the thickest part of the cylinder is aligning with them and they cannot escape. So there you have it. That is essentially what the most optimal inescapable backstab looks like to give yourself the best chance of it going through on high latency. On low latency, you don't have to be nearly this precise, and you can 100% guarantee it, since as soon as your opponent rolls away, assuming you're able to get to the correct positioning, you can grab them right out of their roll, so that they cannot turn to face you and make the angle check fail, or get outside the grab box because there is simply no time to do so. Again, this is why it is called the inescapable. But it only works up to a certain latency, as it eventually gets to a certain point where we can no longer compensate for the amount of ping. In Dark Souls 3, the inescapable is only consistent up to around 100 ping, due to the factors previously mentioned, such as the longer roll distance and smaller grab box. Whereas in Elden Ring, you can do them all the way up to around 275 ping with good execution, which means you should be able to do them to almost anyone you fight, unless you happen to live in a country with notoriously high ping to the majority of the player base. It is worth noting that with both games, the possible range of latencies can increase even further, and it can still be effective as long as your opponent is not mashing roll immediately, just meaning that it is no longer a true inescapable backstab. Now that you know the ideal positioning we are looking for with a backstab, and you hopefully have a bit better understanding of latency and how it comes into play or interacts with backstabs, let's move on to the other types of roll punish backstabs with those things in mind. First, let's start with the roll-in punish backstab. This is probably one of the most common and consistent backstabs to get, because it can be done on reaction most of the time. Usually, you can set up this backstab out of hit stun, as players will often roll in against certain weapon setups out of their stun. More on this later when I get into the best weapon setups for fishing, but this is one of the things that I consider when looking for a good setup to fish for backstabs with. Additionally, with some weapon setups, you can even get a roll-in punish backstab as an opponent rolls your attack. Although this is less consistent, it usually requires your attack to have very low recovery, and your opponent will often be able to escape it if they are aware of the necessary actions in order to do so. Nonetheless, you can still get backstabs quite frequently in this manner with the right attacks. Next, we have side roll backstab punishes. The exact same concepts apply, except this type of backstab generally has to be done more based on prediction. Depending on the weapon setup you're using, and the stun level of your attack, it may be helpful to have a toggle weapon, such as a misericord that you can swap to, in order to cut down some of your recovery. Also, the stun level will determine the timing for when you want to run in for the backstab. This all comes with experience and knowing what works with the attack you hit your opponent with, but hopefully you can get a good general idea from these examples. Finally, we have the backwards roll backstab, for when you recognize your opponent is trying to get away from you. This backstab is probably the most difficult out of all the roll punish backstabs, but it might also be the most common behavior from other players. So if you can master it, it's a great asset. Now, you might be wondering how you can know if you should expect a backwards roll or a side roll, and if so, which direction? Well, this is another thing that simply comes from experience over time and learning the specific situations. There is, however, a simple rule that tends to have a pretty high success rate. The most common expected behavior from players is that they will roll in the direction they are moving. So, for example, if a player is backing up while healing and you hit them, they will likely roll backwards. Or, if they are strafing to the right when you hit them, they will likely roll to the right. That will conclude the analysis on roll punish backstabs for now, and we can move on to the next category or type, which is roll backstabs. Similar to the previous category, but this time we will be the ones doing the rolling. This type of backstab used to be a staple of fishing in previous games, but is best used more sparingly and in specific situations in Elden Ring. The roll backstab is pretty much reserved for only slow weapons or attacks with a fair amount of recovery, which there aren't many of, which is the main problem. On top of most attacks having quite low recovery, the angle check that is present for backstabs also adds to their lack of effectiveness and inconsistency. So keep in mind that these perhaps shouldn't be your go-to backstab, but are useful occasionally. The execution is pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. You simply roll an opponent's attack in towards them at the right distance so that you end up at their back as you complete your roll, and then you turn and grab the backstab. In saying this, you may have already made the connection and realized the other problem with this type of backstab. Recall from earlier that an opponent rolling in is actually one of the best ways to get a backstab, so by rolling in on an opponent's attack, a competent opponent can recognize this and simply turn and backstab you instead. Pretty crazy, right? This is your first taste of counterfishing, but again, more on this later. For now, you just need to know that there are these risks to roll backstabs, and that the lower the recovery of the attack you're trying to roll backstab, the higher the risk or inconsistency. Moving on to the next category, we have strafing or pivot backstabs. These backstabs mainly leverage spacing and movement. Strafe backstabs refer to moving in a way that your opponent's attack does not track you accurately while locked on, and therefore you can avoid their attack hitbox at close range without needing to dodge roll. There are already some great videos out there that I recommend you check out, going into detail with many examples of how to strafe backstab different weapon setups, so I'll stick to showing a few of the most important and niche or lesser known ones. Pivot backstabs, or simply a pivot, refers to the movement of turning your character around, and applied to fishing, there are two particular ways that you will do this. The first way is done without blocking. You sprint forward, do a small half circle, let go of sprint, and then press R1. Remember, you always need to let go of sprint before attempting a backstab, as you cannot get a backstab grab while sprinting. The second method is done by holding block. If you hold block with a weapon or shield, you can change directions instantly by simply inputting backward to turn your character. The blocking method is a bit more risky, especially if you're blocking with a weapon, as you could get guard broken, and this is also an input sequence that causes input drops. So, make sure you identify the input drop timing to avoid it. However, there's an interesting interaction with blocking and backstabs. If you hold block at the correct time before getting a backstab grab, you can actually desync that backstab grab animation and have it be invisible to your opponent. This can be helpful as it's not immediately apparent what you are doing, and therefore a whiffed backstab grab becomes much less punishable. You may find it helpful to practice both of these methods on some early game PvE enemies, or simply in an open area. The reason to practice pivoting in these particular ways is that we are trying to avoid this skidding animation, which was described at one point as what it looks like when you realize that you left your kids at Walmart, so it is often called the Walmart animation. This animation is nightmare fuel for a fisher, because not only does it stop you from being able to get the backstab, but you're also locked into this animation where you cannot roll out for an impactful amount of time, and it also puts you in instability frames, meaning that if you get hit during this animation, you will also take extra damage. So hopefully it's clear by now that we want to be very deliberate with our inputs to avoid this animation. This technique for pivoting and moving is the fundamental part that applies to other backstabs, such as the roll punish ones. So, get to practicing, and make sure that you have this down so that you don't get accidental running attacks, or the Walmart animation when you try pivoting your character for a backstab. As a bonus note, alternatively, there is one final method that you can use if you're playing keyboard and mouse, called the camera pivot, where you simply hold down W and then whip your camera around 180 with your mouse, and you will never get the Walmart animation. It looks pretty silly and a bit jarring, but worth noting if that is your input method of choice. Another essential type of backstab to know is the backstep backstab. Using a backstep is a great way to quickly get behind an opponent for a backstab, and can be used in a variety of situations. Arguably more essential and effective than the standard backstep, however, is the reverse backstep. The reverse backstep can be used to get behind a player after rolling or blocking one of their attacks, out of hit stun, when being chased, and many others. One of my personal favorite uses for it is to punish a heal. This is one of the best ways you can get high burst damage when someone heals when you are in range. To do a reverse backstep, it's the same as doing a normal backstep, except quickly after releasing your dodge button, you want to input a movement direction. You actually have full control over your backstep direction, and you can angle it any way that you want. It doesn't have to be directly backwards, and many situations will even require a slight angle adjustment to direct yourself precisely where you want to go. Finally, we have Dodge Ash of War backstabs. Within this category, we have Reverse Quickstep or Bloodhound Step backstabs, and Quickstep Circle backstabs. I've left these ones for last as they are a couple of the most cheesy ways to get backstabs. The main reason that they are seen as cheesy is because they can be done without the need for a good read and on reaction to an opponent's attack, with a high success rate that is not proportional to the relatively low amount of skill or knowledge required to execute. For these reasons, they are not seen as impressive and often looked down upon by other fishers. However, with the amount of cheese there is in Elden Ring, this is relatively tame in comparison, let's be honest. So sometimes you gotta do what is needed to get the job done. Just don't expect that others will be impressed by you pulling one of these off. To do Reverse Quickstep or Bloodhound Step, it is very similar to a Reverse Backstep, where we can aim it in whichever direction we want. Only this time, we need to start by being locked onto our opponent. Then we Quickstep or Bloodhound Step, and unlock while inputting the desired reverse direction with our movement control. To do a Quickstep Circle backstab, we start locked onto our opponent, and then input movement to the side at the same time as you Quickstep, which will cause your character to perform a tight circle right around your opponent to their back. With both of these types of backstabs, you can input to get a backstab grab right out of the dodge, and their use case is based on your proximity to your opponent. That is pretty much the only thing that you need to think about when going for these backstabs. Reverse Bloodhound Step will cover the most distance, then Reverse Quickstep, and finally you want to Quickstep Circle when right and close. And of course, I have to give an honorary mention to the Crucible Talisman that grants iframes on backsteps for the cheesy backstab category. And there you have it. Those are all the main types of backstabs for you to master, and as promised, I will tell you how to avoid getting backstabbed yourself. Funnily enough, by learning all of these ways to get backstabs, and practicing yourself, you can probably extrapolate pretty well how you can avoid them with a bit of experience and experimentation. But it really all comes down to not doing the things that we have gone over, which are punishable. Without getting too much into the counterfishing side of things just yet, the most important thing to know is that your quickest escape from a backstab is to simply turn and face your opponent. Recall that there is an angle check, and we can cause that to fail the moment we input to turn our character around to face our opponent. So, as silly as it might seem, it is actually that simple. As for avoiding getting backstabbed in other situations, such as getting inescapable, there are a few things that you can do. I want to mention this situation in particular, as I often see even very experienced players get backstabbed in this way, including myself occasionally when I don't expect an inexperienced player to end up getting one. But it's not that uncommon for new players to do it, even accidentally if the latency is low, since, as mentioned, it's pretty forgiving with execution in Elden Ring. The most important thing to not get inescapable backstabbed is to have good roll discipline, and not panic roll while someone is chasing you. Additionally, doing things such as tossing rope pots behind you, a quick turn and burn attack, or doing reverse backsteps are good ways to get someone off your tail. Jumping is also a good option as well, because you cannot get backstab grabbed for a short duration after jumping. A special effect gets applied which prevents opponents from being able to get a backstab grab on you, and we can visualize this by making the character take on a phantom appearance for the duration of the special effect. When this effect is applied to your character, other players are unable to get a backstab grab on you, even if they are in the correct position to do so. It gets applied as you are landing from a jump, and it lasts for 0.7 seconds. On the other side though, it's important to note that you also cannot get a backstab grab while this effect is applied to you either. So if you have ever jumped shortly before going for a backstab and weren't able to get a grab, now you know why. Another important thing to be aware of that will help make you a better player. Now that we've talked a fair amount about how backstabs work and the main ways to get them, what are the best weapon setups to use for fishing? Of course, your weapon setup isn't nearly as important as good reads and execution, but it could be hindering your ability to get backstabs. Not just in the sense that people might not be as likely to give you a simple roll-in backstab, but your weapon choice can actually make it easier or more difficult to get a backstab. And no, I'm not talking about a slow grab versus a fast grab. For those of you that played a fair amount of Dark Souls 3, you may recall there being a difference between the so-called slow backstab grabs and fast grabs. For weapons that did this poking or thrusting grab with their backstab attempt, not only was the actual animation shorter in recovery than its slow grab counterpart, but it also initiated the spawn of the cylindrical grab box faster. This fast grab has 6 frames of startup, followed by 2 active grab frames on frames 6 and 7. The slow grab, on the other hand, has 9 frames of startup, followed by 3 active grab frames on frames 9, 10, and 11. So this so-called slow grab was actually notably slower to initiate than the fast grab, but it had an extra active frame. Prepared with this information as a Souls veteran, you may be inclined to think that the same applies to Elden Ring, especially since it looks so similar with the small weapons having this fast grab and the large ones having this slow grab, just like Dark Souls 3. But that's not actually the case. As described near the beginning of this video, the Elden Ring backstab grab animation has 6 frames of startup, with the grab box being present for 2 frames, on frames 6 and 7, and this applies to all weapons. So there is not actually such thing as a slow and fast grab, besides the differences in recovery. This is a cool thing to be aware of because it means that all the weapons are on an even playing field and can be used effectively to backstab fish, right? Right? Well, nope. There's something else. Different weapons actually have different sizes for their cylindrical grab box. The quote-unquote standard grab box size in Elden Ring is 0.7 units, which as previously mentioned is larger than the one in DS3, which is 0.5 units. There are a number of weapon classes and particular weapons that have a smaller grab box. These include heavy thrusting swords, colossal weapons, thrusting shields, hand-to-hand, reverse hand blades, beast claws, and great katanas, with heavy thrusting swords having the absolute worst grab, as you can see. Additionally, some particular weapons with worse grabs are the throwing blade or smith's grip dagger and Vrolana's twin blades. All other weapons have the standard 0.7 unit grab box. So with that being said, we can pretty much eliminate all these weapons from having a spot on my top fishing setup list, as using them for backstabs would just be putting yourself at an unnecessary disadvantage in comparison. Now without any further ado, my recommendations for fishing setups include two-handed or power-stanced great spear, light greatsword, besides Rolana's, with offhand shield, moonveil or power-stance katanas, greatsword two-handed or one-handed with a shield, curved greatsword, colossal swords, halberd with an offhand, and great shield. Starting with the two-handed great spear, this is my main weapon of choice due to its versatility and overall decent spot in the meta. I have mained great spears pretty much since day 1 of Elden Ring, and it is probably my favorite weapon class that I'm comfortable with in a wide variety of situations and matchups. Tree Spear, Lance, Spear of the Imperialer, Siluria's Tree, and Vikes are all decent options for different scenarios. Serpent Hunter used to be an excellent option as well before its crouch attacks were nerfed. The staple move for these weapons is the crouch attack, as it has hyper armor, long enough stun combined with a short enough recovery that you can set up roll punish backstabs and even get the occasional backstab as a player rolls in through your attack. On top of that, the crouch attacks have fast enough startup that they are difficult to reaction roll consistently, especially with feints and animation blending, which is why you can often force some panic rolls. Finally, as a bonus, its moveset is fairly complete, with great pressure with the jumping attack R1s, and the running and neutral R1s even have their place as well, which makes the weapon class much more interesting and enjoyable to play. Power-stanced great spears are also a decent option, particularly against more knowledgeable players who try to abuse the reduced tracking on the crouch L1 by rolling in to escape a vortex, which you can backstab. Next up, we have the light greatsword, specifically paired with an offhand shield. Relady is likely going to be your best choice in this category. It is a great choice for competitive meta fishing because it is a very strong setup for pure rustic play as well, mainly revolving around guard counters. For fishing in particular, it has quite a few things going for it. Most notably, it is a setup that is at its best and most effective with a shield, so you can go for strafe backstabs more safely and have access to parries or perfect blocks. Another great tech for getting backstabs. More on those later. It also has attacks such as the running R2, which innately frame trap unless you roll in on them, which presents opportunities for roll-in punish backstabs. For Moonveil, its main feature is its ranged Ash of War, which has very high stun in comparison to its attack recovery. This means that we have plenty of time to set up roll punish backstabs out of stun, even from a distance off a roll catch. Being able to roll catch on reaction with the Ash of War can apply a lot of pressure and will often make inexperienced players get into a loop of mashing roll, giving you plenty of opportunities for predictable rolls to backstab. Greatsword is also a decent option for fishing, as you have good maneuverability with it, with access to hyper armor, and mixing in crouch R1s and R2s with a greatsword like Claymore tends to make a lot of players roll in when you bait them with your movement. Greatsword isn't a particularly strong weapon class in Elden Ring, but it is quite fun to use and players will often underestimate it. Using a greatsword one-handed with a shield is also a decent option, as the R1s have good coverage, and many players tend to feel confident mashing out a hitstun against it. Using the Dark Moon greatsword in particular, one-handed with a shield, is a good option once you have it buffed up, as you don't need access to your Ash of War, and the projectiles are great for making players roll in. Curved greatsword is one of my favorite weapons for fishing, particularly in invasions, mainly because of its hyper armor R1s, which allow you to turn and burn groups of people and stop them from mashing into you, with the potential to burst players with simple R1 into R2 roll catch. The running R1s are also great for finishing players off, and again the high damage means that you can eliminate players with just a few attacks, or even just one attack followed by a crit. In short, this weapon allows for swift disposal and is great for finishing fights quickly when incorporating crits. Moving on to Colossal Swords, this is another weapon class that I enjoy for invasions, with the high damage, good coverage for hitting multiple targets, hyper armor, and the added chaos of an invasion makes it harder to react to its slower attacks, thus making it more effective in these chaotic scenarios. I think that a lot of players tend to stray away from large weapons like this, mainly due to the misconception that it has a worse grab, which is simply not the case, as I have shown. You do have to be a bit careful when you go for a backstab grab, however, as you have an even longer recovery time on a backstab whiff. But both types of whiffed backstabs are quite punishable, so you really don't want to be whiffing backstabs either way. Cancelling into movement with the lower recovery backstab is 14 frames slower than in Dark Souls 3, and for the higher recovery version, it is 31 frames slower, so both grabs are much higher commitment in Elden Ring than previously. Next, we have halberds with an offhand. Halberds are a nice choice as they work very well one-handed, which gives you flexibility for your offhand. You can pair it with anything from a offhand dagger or axe for a top tier 1v1 setup to a shield for maximum crit fishing options. One-handed halberd has solid stun that allows time to get into position for backstabs, but players also try to mash out of its stun quite often, making for easy parries. Additionally, you get great chase down pressure by simply chaining the running attacks, which inexperienced players often have a difficult time not getting roll caught over and over again by, due to the aggression you can have with a one-handed halberd. Finally, we have great shield setups. Great shield setups in general just go back to the previously mentioned benefits of having a shield, such as being able to go for perfect blocks, and being able to pressure more safely and give yourself some leniency by blocking damage if you mess up. Now, with all this being said, it is not to say that you cannot use any other weapon setups for fishing, or that the weapons with the worst backstab grabs are useless for fishing. There are many other setups out there that you can make work well by simply being aware of these weaknesses. Great Katana or Dueling Shield, for example, are excellent weapons for backstab fishing, despite the fact that they have a smaller grab. One of the easiest ways you can work around a weapon with a worse grab is by having a toggle weapon with a good grab. Misericord, for example, is usually going to be your best option, as it's lightweight and will most often result in the highest damage crits thanks to its 140 crit multiplier. On to how parries work. Parries, how exciting. One of the best ways to style on an opponent, super satisfying, and also very effective with extremely high burst damage. But another mechanic that players often have difficulty making work consistently in PvP. Luckily, with a decent understanding of how they work, and a bit of practice, I'm sure that you can get to start landing them too. So how do parries work then? Well, they seem pretty straightforward. You see an attack coming towards you, and you activate a parry slightly before you expect it to hit you, so that you will deflect the attack and get the chance to riposte the opponent. Against the PvE, it is pretty much that simple. Once you get the timing down to parry an attack, you'll be all set and land them no problem. But PvP is a totally different story. Parries are another mechanic that are greatly affected by that complicated, scary, and sometimes frustrating thing we all have to deal with, latency. But luckily, once again, we can learn to deal with it to an extent and adapt. When you parry, a circular hitbox will be spawned in front of you, and the number of frames that that hitbox is active is referred to as your parry frames. If another player's attack collides with this hitbox, then they will be parried. So the more parry frames that your parry tool gives you, the better, as the timing becomes more forgiving, and the more parry frames, the more chances you have, essentially. Different types of parries or parry tools will determine the amount of parry frames that you get, and when in the animation they occur, so the type of parry that you have equipped is an important consideration. Luckily, to keep things simple, but perhaps uninteresting, there is a pretty clear best parry in Elden Ring. If you're looking for the best parry, in my opinion, your go-to should be Carrion Retaliation on a brass shield. The reason for this is that the Carrion Retaliation Ash of War has the most parry frames out of all the parries in the game, with 6 active parry frames. 4 frames of startup, with 6 active parry frames starting on frame 4 and ending at frame 10. That alone is a pretty compelling reason to use Carrion Retaliation, but there are also other reasons. Golden Parry used to be a close runner-up as it previously had the same startup and number of active parry frames as Carrion Retaliation, but it was nerfed and they were cut in half to just 3 frames. Golden Parry also has the added benefit of being able to parry players from a further distance, but at the cost of FP. Even before this nerf, I would always recommend Carrion Retaliation to parry, as if you're going for parries frequently, you probably don't want to be using all that precious FP. On top of that, it was questionable if the extra range was even really helpful in PvP, as many players won't even attack if it's obviously not going to reach you, and if you did parry someone at maximum range, it might actually be difficult to even get to them in time for the riposte. Regardless of this, Carrion Retaliation is now pretty much the undisputed best parry after the changes made. So don't make it more difficult to land the parry than it needs to be, and make sure you're using Carrion Retaliation, unless you're going for style points of course. Additionally, recall that I mentioned specifically putting it on a brass shield. This is because it has the highest guard boost out of all the medium shields in the game, which means if you get the incorrect timing for a parry, you'll have the least amount of stamina consumption. So there you have it, you've got your brass shield out with Carrion Retaliation, or another parry tool if you're about fashion over function, and you're out in the wild spamming parries. But they still aren't landing, so what gives? Well, there are a couple things that I haven't mentioned yet. The first and most impactful thing to note is that parries are fully reliant on what your opponent sees on their screen. So this goes back to the latency thing and how we need to compensate for it and adapt. Compared to a player like PvE enemy such as a silver tier, to land a parry successfully, we will need to parry earlier by the amount of latency that we have to that other person. So for example, if your opponent has 200 milliseconds of latency, we will need to press parry roughly 200 milliseconds earlier against the same attack in order for it to land in the same way it does against the silver tier. Now, if you've managed to time your parry correctly for whichever attack you're trying to parry, then you should land the parry. But regardless of the latency, what exactly is timing it correctly? The second thing is that you need to actually be attempting to parry a parryable attack, and not all attacks in Elden Ring are parryable. For example, a two-handed R1 from a colossal sword is not parryable. So what determines that? Well, those are the parryable frames of the attack itself. So your parry tool has parry frames, and whatever attack your opponent is trying to hit you with has its own parryable frames, if it's parryable. And when those both align, that is when you actually get a parry. These parryable frames on attacks are often quite few, as in just 1 or 2 parryable frames that usually appear at the beginning of the attack animation, and don't necessarily coincide with when the attack hitbox is active. Once again, just with this information, I hope that you already have a bit better understanding of how to get parries. But there are many different techniques and strategies that we can use to help get parries more consistently, so I'd like to go through some of the most common and consistently reliable ways to get parries. Parries can essentially be broken down into 2 main categories: reaction parries and prediction parries. Some parries can be done purely on reaction, depending on the latency of course, and others are done only based on prediction. Additionally, you could add a bonus third category, as some other parries are sort of a mix of both reaction and prediction. The first, and probably most simple, but also effective type of parry is the setup parry. It is done by blocking an attack from your opponent, and then parrying their follow-up attack, assuming they continue their attack chain. This is a parry that was probably most effective in previous games with R1 into R1 true combos, since it was very common to attack at least twice for the guaranteed true combo damage. If they didn't realize that you blocked their first attack, or queued another R1 out of habit, then it would be a free parry. Although Elden Ring doesn't have many true combos, there are still plenty of people who will mash attacks into you, so it's far from being obsolete. It's also a pretty safe parry since you're blocking the damage of the first attack, and it helps with your timing since against most weapon classes, you'll simply block the first attack, and then parry pretty much right after. As a note for the rest of the video going forward, I'm not going to go into the exact timings to parry every single weapon class or every single attack chain this works against, as there are simply so many different combinations, and even if I were to attempt to list all the situations, it's unrealistic to think that you'd be able to memorize every single scenario, so in the interest of time, and being realistic, I will not be attempting to cover every possible variation and interaction with parries, but instead, I'll provide you with the basic concepts and principles so you have the tools that you need to improve your fishing, as a lot of fishing comes down to experience that must be gained firsthand. The best thing that I hope you will do is continue to take in the information in this video, practice the techniques described, and then experiment yourself with different methods, as you're certainly not limited to only using the methods described in this video, and that goes for backstabs as well. I'll provide some jumping off points for experimentation and other ideas in the advanced section, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself again. Back to parries, there are other videos out there which go into detail about very specific situations of how exactly to set up a certain parry. If that's appealing, you can check them out after this video if you still feel like you would like some more specific guidance and ideas. But as always, there will continue to be background footage and examples of real PvP use cases for all the techniques I go over. And as I said, I would really encourage you to branch out after learning the basic principles, and not stick to one particular method of getting a parry or backstab that you find works, as being able to adapt to a wide variety of situations based on your opponent's gameplay is necessary to be a successful fisher. Another note about these types of parries is that, as we've established, latency plays a large part in getting them in PvP, since it's all about what your opponent sees on their screen, so each of these methods will be assuming that you have reasonable latency to your opponent, unless otherwise stated. Setup parries, for example, will not work if the latency is too high, as the other player simply won't see you start the parry animation soon enough, because there's essentially a limit to how soon you can start the parry, since you're blocking their attack first. This is the main thing that prevents me from going over all the different interactions, as there are simply too many possible scenarios with different latencies, and this is where it'll come down to experience with what will work, and practicing the timing for your parries on different latencies. Moving on to the next type of parry, we have the roll into parry. This parry again relies on your opponent attacking multiple times in succession, but this time, instead of blocking their first attack, you roll it. Especially on high latency, this parry can be abused. Rolling in and then parrying is quite strong on high latency. When players get frustrated about not being able to catch double rolls, they tend to start mashing attacks more carelessly, and rolling before your parry, and then even immediately after, can make it very difficult to be punished on high latency. Similar to the roll into parry, often just spacing an attack and then going back in to parry a follow-up can be effective. It's also safer especially on lower latency, and against more experienced players, as recall, rolling in is punishable with a backstab. But it becomes increasingly safer the higher the latency, so that's what makes the roll into parry more favorable on higher lat. Although the roll into parry is more risky, it does encourage people to mash more, I've found. Even inexperienced players seem to be less likely to mash a follow-up if you space the initial attack, and it doesn't hit you, so both still have their place on all latencies. It all just comes down to reading your opponent and taking what they're giving you, which is essentially what fishing comes down to at its core. For instance, if your opponent seems very unlikely to know how to punish a roll-in, and they simply aren't attacking multiple times when you're out of range, then a roll-in parry might not be a bad idea. Next, we have hit-stun parries. These are still prediction parries most of the time, but it's pretty much the bread and butter of parries. Setting up parries out of hit-stun are a great idea, as putting your opponent into hit-stun helps you to align your timing regardless of the latency, and this is what makes them so strong. By putting your opponent into hit-stun, if you know the timing to parry on low latency for whatever stun your particular attack has, then it will remain roughly the same no matter the latency, if they attack out of the stun in the same way. This is because the stun duration will be the same amount of time no matter the latency, and although you may see them take the hit late on high ping, recall that the only thing that matters is what your opponent sees on their screen, so as long as the timing between your attack and the parry remains the same, it will line up on their screen. You can comfortably line up these types of parries with weapons like a halberd, greatsword, great spear, and others, and you can make many other weapons and attacks work well by hard swapping to a shield for your parry. Which leads me into the next sort of subcategory, which is swap parries. Hard swapping or soft swapping is sort of its own type of parry, but it can be combined with other types such as setting it up out of hit stun. Swapping to parry is an excellent option to catch your opponent off guard and stay unpredictable. One of the biggest mistakes as a beginner, against an experienced player, is deciding you want to go for a parry and then switching to your shield before continuing the fight, which is generally pretty telegraphed and allows your opponent to play around that now that they expect a parry is coming. This is why your swaps must be done quickly and in the middle of combat. One of the easiest ways to catch your opponent off guard with a parry is to have a parry tool on toggle, and then set up a parry out of hit stun by hitting your opponent with an attack, and then toggling to your parry tool and parrying them out of hit stun, when you predict that they will mash. This way, you're hiding the fact that you have access to a parry tool, so your opponent will feel safe mashing into you, since they don't actively see a threat of a potential parry. This works especially well against hyper armor weapon users. For example, if you're using a two-handed straight sword, and they're using a greatsword, they will probably feel pretty comfortable mashing into you. Then, we have the hard swap parries. These are great because you don't always need to have the shield equipped in a toggle slot, but it requires a bit more practice to get comfortable with your swaps. There are many ways that you can navigate your menus for a parry. For example, you can swap your main hand to a parry tool, swap your offhand to a parry tool, or from a no-skill shield to a parry shield, and unequip your offhand or main hand to access a parry. This is especially effective at surprising your opponents, as you can effectively have access to an instant parry without a parry tool in sight. Especially if you are already in your menu, you can hover over your parry tool and then select and close your menu to go for a parry whenever the time is right. This is super powerful, as you can reaction parry attacks this way. Even on high latency, you can pseudo-reaction parry by reacting to another player's movement rather than the attack itself. You can see in the following example clip that I'm actually reacting to my opponent turning around, and I can guess with pretty good confidence that an attack is coming as soon as they start going towards me. This is the type of thing that comes with practice and knowing how to read other players. Speaking of reaction parries, there are very few attacks that you can reliably reaction parry on anything more than near perfect connection, so reaction parries are probably the least common type of parry, excluding parries that are pseudo-reactions, where you're reacting to the opponent's movement and other actions, as the parryable frames of attacks tend to be too early on in the animations. And remember, it's not just about reacting to the attack itself, you need the other player to be seeing your parry line up on their screen. Additionally, recall that parries are not instant either. There's a startup to the animations before you actually reach parry frames on your parry tool. Another type of pseudo-reaction parry, however, is the second hit parry. This is a type of parry that works on mid to high latency, and it involves predicting that your opponent will mash with a relatively fast weapon. For example, a dagger. You can actually react to the initial attack of the dagger and parry the second hit of the dagger instead of the first one, as you abuse the block frames of your parry tool to continue the animation and let the parry line up with their second attack instead. This is a pretty cool interaction that many players don't know about, and it will probably leave your opponent shaking their head about how you did that to them. This is definitely something that can be frustrating if you aren't watching out for it, as an inexperienced player who is simply mashing parry can end up being rewarded with a riposte even without a proper understanding of latency, since funnily enough, by simply reacting to the initial attack, the timing could be correct for a second hit parry, depending on the latency. Despite the fact that this parry timing would never work on lower latency, they can unknowingly time a second hit parry correctly, which is probably quite surprising for them, and is likely a contributing factor to confusing people as to how parries work in PvP, and making them seem even somewhat random. So a new player mashing parry might luck out and get one of these, but you, being equipped with this knowledge and intentionally going for them when the connection is right, can be very effective. The last main type of parry I want to mention is the roll catch timing parry. This parry is sort of the reverse of a hit stun setup parry, as this time you're the one that's in hit stun. This is another thing that comes with experience, as there are simply too many potential scenarios that this works for to go over, but there are certain sequences of attacks that you will recognize line up in a way that you'll have enough time to go for a parry out of your own hit stun. Essentially, if you recognize that your opponent is likely to try to go for an attack to catch your panic roll, this is often the perfect timing for you to land a parry on that attack. Often, the timing to land a roll catch with some weapons will be perfect for you to parry them as you come out of hit stun, as it lines up with the same timing that they would need to attack to catch your roll if you panic rolled out of hit stun instead. So you've managed to land a backstab, or a parry and a riposte, but your opponent is still alive. Now what? After a crit, you will have the advantage as you will have some time to get situated while they are still standing up in recovery, and we want to give ourselves the best chance to finish off the fight by preparing and timing particular attacks that work well based on the position they are in. There's a wide variety of different attacks and methods that you can use depending on your build and what your opponent is using. In this section, I will go over some of my favorite wake-ups, including why they work and when you want to use them. Starting with probably the most versatile and my overall favorite, the Spark Aromatic Wake Up. I really like this wake up as it's pretty forgiving on timing to be effective. It works well out of backstabs or ripostes, and most importantly, it provides the opportunity to chain into another backstab almost immediately. The unique thing about Spark Aromatics that differ from a normal attack, not just in the sense that they are consumable, but more importantly, they allow you to hit your opponent without actively being locked into an animation. This means that it's still a threat to hit your opponent while you have full access to movement. That is the key to allowing you to continuously apply pressure after the crit and potentially get another backstab. To do this wake up, you want to unlock from your opponent and throw the Spark Aromatic out in front of you to cover the most distance. And then, from there, your opponent is in a tricky situation, because if they roll backwards, they're rolling right into the Spark Aromatic and will likely get hit by it. If not, then you'll probably be able to finish them off since they will be forced to roll, and you can time for the roll catch. On the other hand, if they roll in, then now you have a great opportunity to go for a backstab on them if they don't immediately roll twice. Thinking that they have outsmarted you by rolling in, your opponent will likely go for an attack, block, or simply wait to react to what you do next. But you can probably land a backstab on them if they do this. I mentioned specifically if they don't immediately roll twice, as if they roll twice immediately, then you won't be able to land a backstab on their first roll. This is because that first, shorter roll that your opponent does out of a crit is a recovery roll, which has additional iframes and will blend into their next roll, meaning that you don't have a chance for a backstab to go through. If they hesitate at all, or do any other action, such as attack however, then you have a good chance for a backstab. This is an important point for all wake-ups, as you can see here that with the recovery roll animation, we can cancel into another roll before the iframes of that recovery roll have ended. So this means that the first roll into the second roll after a crit is essentially unpunishable. This is why most of the best wake-ups revolve around catching and punishing your opponent's second roll. My next go-to wake-up is Falx with its Ash of War. Falx is an extremely strong wake-up for a number of reasons. First of all, it can cover a lot of distance with its Ash of War. It has very strong hyper armor to go through attacks if someone tries to mash into it, making it work well against ganks or hyper armor weapon users, and most importantly, you can release the L2 on reaction to roll catch your opponent. Additionally, it even roll catches into itself. If you land the L2, then simply tapping L2 again does a great job of roll catching an immediate panic roll, which means it can basically vortex with its Ash of War. Another good wake up for builds that don't have access to Falx is Ice Spear. Ice Spear is good because it has multiple hits. First, it has a hitbox on the initial weapon spin, which you want to time so that your opponent needs to roll immediately on wake up. Then the projectile lines up very well to catch their second roll. This one can be deceptive as your opponent may not roll immediately on wake up, since they initially don't see you starting up an attack until the last second when you use the Ice Spear in their face, which cannot be reacted to consistently. So they will get hit by it if they decide to try to reaction roll what you do on wake up. If you end up hitting this initial spin, then it will true combo into the projectile for some big damage. Probably my third most used wake up is quite simple. Endure into Thrusting Sword. This is probably one of the safest and most reliable wake up options, especially against multiple players when you just need one or two more hits to eliminate someone. This is why I usually have Endure on the Misericord daggers that I riposte or backstab with. So often it comes in clutch to not let that one player slip away when you are so close to getting rid of them. Using Endure to prevent them from mashing into you or getting knocked out by another player is very helpful, and you can apply great pressure with two-handed Thrusting Sword, so there's a good chance you're going to be able to get those last one or two hits that you need. Next up, we have the Winged Scythe Ash of War. I really like this attack, especially on high latency, when I know my opponent will likely be able to mash roll through most of my attacks, as this attack doesn't actually need to connect in order to be effective and serve its purpose. On high latency, you are very likely to at least get a phantom hit even if they dodge the attack, which is just what we want, since now they will be unable to use their healing flask for the next 30 seconds, which is usually enough time for me to be able to land some hits to eliminate them. This next wake up requires a very particular build, but it can create one of the nastiest frame traps in the entire game. There are multiple variants you can do depending on the situation, but it revolves around the Vortex of Putrescence spell. This spell is great for wake ups as it's a similar situation to Spark Aromatic, where with max cast speed you can cast it, and then have time to do other things while the spell hitboxes are still active. My favorite combo with the Vortex of Putrescence is probably Vortex into Piercer, because Piercer can anti-air. Vortex is generally not able to be rolled consistently, so the better option is usually to jump it instead. So even if your opponent knows this, you'll probably still be able to hit them with the Piercer. If they get hit by the Vortex instead, then it should true combo into your Piercer for massive damage, which is another reason why I like this combo so much. If you land both the Vortex and the Piercer after a crit, it's highly unlikely that anyone will be able to tank all that damage, essentially making it a potential 100-0 combo after a crit. Even if your opponent decides to try to immediately mash into you instead of rolling away, it's likely that they will still get hit by the Vortex, and if you know that they will likely mash into you after the backstab, for some reason, then you can simply use some sort of hyper armor attack, such as Wild Strikes, Freezing Mist, Storm Stomp, or simply Endure. Another decent consumable wake up is using a Call of Tibia. Call of Tibia is an interesting consumable, as it can be a real knowledge check, as it's more threatening than it appears. If you throw a tibia off to the side or slightly behind your opponent, then you can make it more difficult for them to see it and react to the skeleton swings. If they do happen to get poise broken by one of the swings, then it's actually level 2 hit stun, which will allow you to true combo into quite a few attacks from that stun, which is what really makes it threatening. Not to mention that again, you have the benefits of some active hitbox attacks in the area while you're not locked into any animation. One of the coolest looking wake ups in my opinion is Winged Stance, and there's some tech involved with it, which makes pulling it off extra satisfying. Winged Stance is a decent wake up that hits quite hard, and again we want to time it to catch our opponent's second roll. You can see that initially it doesn't look like it would be a great wake up, as it doesn't seem to go far enough. However, if you unlock when using Winged Stance, and then lock on just as you're going for the thrust attack, you can prevent yourself from getting stuck, and you'll be able to use the full potential range of this Ash. Another wake up that is quite crazy looking, but is surprisingly effective, is the One-Eyed Shield. The One-Eyed Shield works well because its projectile has a lot of active frames to catch rolls, and it's a bit of a knowledge check, as it isn't clear what the best approach to counter it is. It does well at catching players who are panic rolling away, and if you try to attack into the shield, then it won't work because you have block frames with its stance. If you try to backstab it, then it can be aimed down and you won't be able to get around in time for the backstab before getting hit. And if you try to roll and then heal, you'll probably get hit while trying to heal. Some honorable mentions that you've seen examples of scattered throughout include the Beastclaw Greathammer Ash, Tree Spear R2, Grail's Roar, Roar of Rugalia, Jumping Away with a Great Bow, Mesmer's Orb, Sword of Night, and others. Moving on to Guardbreaks, another way to get crits. For Guardbreaks, there are two main methods to get them. First, I would recommend keeping a Vulgar Militia Shodel with Royal Knight's Resolve on it in your inventory. The reason for this is that it has an attack that is impossible to withstand by blocking. If you land a fully charged R2 with RKR active, then it will Guardbreak someone even if they have 99 endurance and Barricade Shield active on a Fingerprint Shield with Great Shield Talisman equipped. It's really nice to have this guaranteed Guardbreak option if you can catch someone off guard by hitting them around a corner with it, or if they simply get cocky thinking that they can block this attack. That being said, it can be a bit difficult to land if the other player is experienced with using shields in PvP, so you do have the option of going for the jumping R2, which does almost enough stamina to Guardbreak maximum guard, while being much easier to land. If they do pretty much anything to consume stamina before trying to block your R2, then they will get guard broken, so it's also an effective option. Not to mention that you also have access to your running R1s and R2s for pressure that do good chip damage through shields, and you can also intentionally desync to be extra devious. Speaking of desyncing attacks, that is something that pairs quite well with the other option for getting guard breaks, which are kicks. Quickly unequipping your weapon to kick a shield is a good option for a guard break, and desyncing your kicks can be very effective. If the other player is reacting to your kicks, then simply throwing out a desynced kick could be just what you need to get the guard break. If they don't expect a desynced kick, then it's pretty much going to guarantee that your kick lands. Desyncing attacks is something that can be done by blocking at a particular timing before attacking. The timing varies based on the type of block that you're doing, but is roughly tap block, just as the block is finishing being lowered, tap block again, and then use your attack, or dodge right after. Another Ashe that becomes quite good for guard breaks with a desync is Shield Bash. This Ashe does quite good stamina damage, and swapping between a no-skill shield and another one of the same shields with Shield Bash is quite helpful, as your opponent will have a very difficult time knowing what to expect. Another benefit of Shield Bash is that it has more range than the kick. Before we get into the advanced fishing strategies, I quickly want to go over fishing some notoriously difficult to fight setups. An important note before I talk about fishing some specific attacks, I want to mention that there are strategies and techniques that you can use to help you get crits in some difficult matchups that I'll talk about shortly, but fishing isn't really something that you can force in this game. In previous games such as Dark Souls 3, fishing could pretty much be your entire playstyle, but in Elden Ring, there are simply some situations where it won't work, and it's generally not worth trying to force, so this goes back to fishing being a supplementary tool in your toolkit, rather than something that is always going to be effective. If you encounter an experienced player in Elden Ring who's decided that they don't want to be fished, then they can pretty much guarantee that isn't going to happen by playing in a certain way and using certain attacks, so you just have to recognize that and adapt to the situation if fishing isn't going to be a viable approach. Now, with that being said, there are some particular attacks that I want to mention can actually be fished. For example, with particular movement, you can actually backstab blind spot, like so.
That was really good, actually.
You can also backstab a few other Asher Wars that many players struggle with punishing, and some popular dueling setups.
There you go. There we go. I think that's better. You just can't go too far. If you go too far, then
That's all for the ones that I want to single out, but keep an eye out for other examples scattered throughout the rest of the video, with other attacks you might not know you can fish. Congratulations! You now know all of the basics and have made it to the final section of the video. How exciting. This section of the video contains many miscellaneous advanced strategies, techs, and niche knowledge related to fishing. Let's start things off with a tech that pairs really well with fishing: precise blocks. These are often referred to as being perfect blocks, despite the fact that they are far from needing to be perfect in execution. In fact, they have quite a bit of leniency with the timing. This is a tech that allows you to essentially bypass block stun by abusing an interaction with transitioning to or from the sprinting animation. To do a perfect block, all you need to do is time your transition either to or from sprint with the time that you're getting hit by an attack, and press block. So you can do it either into sprint or by letting go of sprint. Doing them out of sprint is probably the most consistent way, as it can be done on reaction to other players' attacks. As an attack is about to hit you, just let go of sprint, and then press block. There's no need to let go of the block button, and in fact I would advise against it most of the time, as it's safer to keep holding the block, as in case you mistime it, you'll have a better chance of blocking the incoming damage of the attack. Perfect blocks are great for setting up both parries and backstabs. If an opponent is using a weapon that would normally be too fast to set up parry with a normal block, then you can parry it by perfect blocking before you parry instead. Perfect blocking is also great for baiting a second attack from an opponent, because even if the attack hits you, it won't stun you if you time the inputs correctly. This means that your opponent will see you get hit by their attack, and think that it's safe to go for a follow-up, since you should be stunned, when in fact you're not, and you can parry their next attack. Perfect blocks are also pretty much a necessity to get backstabs on certain attacks on high latency. On high latency, it will eventually become impossible to punish even a colossal sword swing on reaction with a backstab, as trying to roll the attack will simply occur too late, and you'll not be able to get to their back before they're out of recovery. With a perfect block, however, we can basically run right through a swing and get to their back much quicker, and give ourselves a much better chance of getting a backstab. Additionally, I found another way in which you can get a similar interaction. You can also time it during a backstep. This method is probably more risky, but I believe it's the fastest possible method to start a backstab after an attack such as a colossal sword swing. One final note about perfect blocks, and probably really their only one weakness, is power stance setups that hit at varying times. Sometimes you can perfect block just one of the attacks and strafe the other, or perfect block one of the attacks and passive poise the other, but in scenarios where you're fighting setups that hit at slightly staggered times, such as some dual colossal sword attacks for example, you may want to consider a different method for getting a backstab, such as using Endure. Using Endure and then simply tanking the attack by walking right through it to get a backstab might be a good idea if you know that player doesn't have the HP to survive one of your backstabs for example. Not nearly as cool or impressive as a perfect block, but Endure backstabs are another option for getting the job done. Using Endure also doesn't mean that you can't go for a perfect block as well to help minimize or nullify the damage either, so they can be paired together as well.
Yeah, it does. That was nice.
The first miscellaneous fact that I want to share is for fighting a specific setup. If you encounter another player who is using power stance colossal weapons, you can actually block their crouch L1s at point blank range without getting any block stun, which opens up the opportunity for a pretty easy backstab. Let's talk about another situation where it's possible to get a backstab that is often misunderstood: getting backstabs off the ground. When you knock your opponent down, is it possible to get a backstab? Well, yes and no. It depends. Some particular types of knockdown animations you can backstab someone right out of, while others you cannot, or at least not consistently. There are two knockdown animations that you can backstab, and those are animations 4260 and 4270. The reason that you're able to backstab these knockdowns, and not the other ones in the 5000 animation ID range, is because of how the dodge cancel window lines up, and the type of roll that you get. You can see here in the animations that the flag as dodging window ends as the window to dodge starts up. This gives us a very small window where the player in the knockdown animation will not be in iframes between the knockdown and them rolling, allowing us to still get a backstab on the other player even if they're spamming roll out of the knockdown, if we time it correctly. You can see that the other knockdown animations have an overlap between the iframes and when the player is able to cancel into a dodge. To get this backstab against a player that has been knocked down into animation 4260, the best position to be in is our optimal inescapable backstab spot, and you can see right as the player's arm becomes vertical is when they come out of iframes. So of course we want to time it so that our backstab grab box is present when they're out of iframes, so that our grab box will become active and the request will be sent. Which means that we want to initiate our grab attempt roughly 6 frames before this point, since recall, grabs have 6 frames of startup before the grab box appears. As for knockdown 4270, you can see that they come out of iframes here shortly after their left leg and arms start to move, so same deal with how to line up the backstab grab timing. For the other knockdown animations, it doesn't mean that you cannot go for a backstab on them, but it just means that it's going to be more of a read. What do I mean by this? Well, despite the fact that you cannot backstab a player that rolls immediately out of these other knockdown animations, it's still good to note when their iframes end, because if you notice that the other player is waiting to roll for some reason, and they appear to no longer be in iframes, you can go ahead and backstab them. On the other hand, if they do roll immediately, then you can backstab that roll as long as they don't roll again immediately, as recall, the recovery roll allows the player to potentially cancel into another roll before its iframes end, so it's all about reading what you think they're going to do. Perhaps you should try to backstab that first recovery roll, or maybe you should wait and try to backstab the second roll if you think they're going to double roll. This is where we start getting a little bit into the mind games and counterfishing. There are also some mind games with the 4260 and 4270 knockdowns. If you're starting to think like a true fisher, then maybe you've thought about simply rolling in to stop yourself from being backstabbed off the ground by causing the angle check to fail. If you did, then well done. If not, no worries, as that is what I'm aiming to teach with this section: how to think like a fisher. So if you recognize that someone is probably going to attempt to backstab you off the ground when you get knocked down into either 4260 or 4270, then it might be a good idea to roll in to make sure that you don't get backstabbed off the ground. However, if the other person is also aware of this, then they may decide to wait and backstab your roll in rather than trying to backstab you off the ground. So again, this is where the mind games come in with counterfishing, when two experienced players are fighting each other. Now you might be wondering how to identify these types of knockdowns. You can tell the difference between these animations and the other knockdowns that cannot be consistently backstabbed by a few indicators. First, if the player has their left hand outstretched above their head when you knock them down, then that's a clear indicator that they're in knockdown animation 4260, so that one's pretty easy to identify. For knockdown 4270 on the other hand, it's a bit more tricky, as there are other face-down knockdowns that leave the player in a similar looking position, but the distance that the player slides on the ground can help to identify it. If the other player is sliding on the ground after being knocked down, or rolling into the faceplant position, this is an indication that they're in some other knockdown animation. If they are sent to the ground in a face-down position without sliding, that's an indicator of 4270. Up next, I want to talk about what I think is one of the coolest backstab techs in Elden Ring: perfect grabs. Perfect grabs are when you engage a backstab grab at the same time as getting hit, and the result is that the backstab grab animation will take priority over the stun, and you will continue to play out the grab animation despite the fact that you got hit. You can see here that it has nothing to do with poise, as I'm doing it without armor against a colossal sword, and you can also get them when you block the attack as well. This is a cool tech because with how precise they are to get, it's quite impressive if you manage to pull one off, and if you know how to position yourself and identify the correct situations to go for them, you can get backstabs in situations where it would otherwise not be possible to do so. Additionally, similar to perfect blocks or going for endure backstabs, they're great for assisting you in getting backstabs on high latency, since you aren't waiting for the attack animation to complete before going for your stab. On top of their functionality, perfect grabs also look quite cool, as your character will often slide while doing the grab animation. Depending on the type of stun, and the higher the latency, the more slide you will get, as it takes longer to confirm the backstab. One of the things that you may have noticed me doing in the first example clip was running to the left and then back to the right just before going for the backstab. This is a very important concept to keep in mind, not just for getting perfect grabs, but it is applicable in pretty much every fishing scenario. I refer to this as lock-on manipulation. Navigating around the effects of an opponent's lock-on is something that I have already shown throughout this video, and it's what allows you to strafe attacks. The locked-on tracking of most attacks in Elden Ring is pretty good, but there are some exceptions, and it's good to know which ones those are. Of course, someone could unlock and free-aim their attack if you're trying to strafe it, but that will take a certain level of awareness, and again, it's something that you'll have to read your opponent to figure out if they will do or not. And as I mentioned, the locked-on tracking is quite good with most attacks, which makes it difficult or impossible to strafe by normal means. This might seem like an issue for fishing, which in some ways it is, as it does make getting simple strafe backstabs less common, but it also means that we can pretty much count on other players attacking locked on almost 100% of the time, and we can still abuse that. To start with, let's go back to my original perfect grab example. Why did I go to the left before strafing back to the right? Well, getting perfect grabs somewhat consistently requires some lock-on manipulation, because with most attacks, they will not hit you at times where you can also engage a backstab grab, with a normal pivot or roll backstab attempt. This is the purpose of running to the opposite side before quickly cutting back. With latency, remember that your opponent's reactions to, or tracking of your movement is going to be delayed, so by running to the left side of my opponent, their tracking is going to follow me to that side, but it's going to of course be delayed. The higher the latency, the more delayed that reaction to my movement is going to be. By cutting back quickly just before going for the backstab grab, this ensures that their tracking doesn't have time to fully adjust to my new position by the time I'm going for the backstab. And this way my opponent is turned in a way that I will be able to see their back when I otherwise would not normally be able to. To show this concept in action once again, with the correct movement and timing, you can get strafe backstabs on weapon attacks that are not normally able to be strafed when your opponent is locked on. For example, by feinting to one side and then going to the other, you can strafe greatsword R1s. Lock-on manipulation isn't only important for getting your backstab grabs, it's also important for getting our backstab attempts to go through. With the introduction of the angle check, we want to make sure that our opponent is not facing us when we're trying to get a backstab to go through. So by abusing their lock-on, we can make their turns more delayed, and hopefully they will not cause the angle check to fail with their tracking. With lock-on manipulation, we can even get a certain type of backstab to land that was a staple of fishing in previous games: the pivot backstab. The pivot backstab was previously a consistent way to backstab players who were chasing you while locked on, but it will pretty much always fail in Elden Ring due to the angle check. With precise lock-on manipulation, we can actually get this type of backstab in Elden Ring. The movement required is running in roughly an S pattern. Admittedly, it's not nearly as consistent as it once was, even with lock-on manipulation, but it is worth knowing, as sometimes it's worth going for from time to time, especially since nobody will be expecting it, and players will not be prepared with the knowledge on how to avoid it. Next, I'd like to talk about another movement or positioning related tech, which is body blocking. The concept itself is pretty simple, but actively applying it and using it to its full potential in your gameplay requires a bit of practice. As the name suggests, the idea is to block the other player with your own player's body. Specifically, it is most applicable to block your opponent's rolls. By positioning yourself in a way that your opponent will likely roll into your character, we can utilize the hitbox of our own character to restrict the movement of our opponent. This can help us to get backstabs because we are keeping their character closer to us. Instead of letting them get the maximum distance on their roll, we obstruct their movement when their roll collides with our player model. When you can predict the direction another player will roll, this is just another way we can help to give ourselves the best chance of that backstab being successful. You can see in these clips just how effective this is and how much of a difference it makes in terms of the distance the other player can roll by getting in their way just enough so that they hardly go anywhere. Body blocking rolls is probably the most common way we can use this concept to help with fishing, but like many of these concepts that I've shared throughout the video, they can be applied in a variety of situations, and it's the blending of all this knowledge that will make you an effective fisher. For instance, when being chased and getting that pivot backstab to land, you can see that it isn't just about the lock-on manipulation, there's also a bit of body blocking going on as well.
Oh my god.
While those concepts sink in, let's break things up a little bit and talk about some parry-specific tech. This is probably not going to help you get parries easier, in fact it actually makes them more difficult to land, but it does look pretty cool I think. It's actually possible to parry someone while facing backwards with the proper execution. This seems to be a PvP exclusive tech due to networking. If you turn at the same time as parrying, the first few frames will actually be in the direction your character was previously facing. So you're missing out on extra parry frames by doing this, but it's probably one of the best ways to style on an opponent and test your parry timing skills. There is one other benefit to parrying like this, or off to the side, which is it nicely sets you up to cancel into a riposte. By locking on shortly before you press R1, you can actually cancel certain actions into a riposte. Amongst other things, a bundle, gesture, or rope punt can all be cancelled with a riposte. You can also cancel consumables into backstabs as well, and there's an important tech related to this. There are two main benefits that we get from cancelling a consumable into a backstab. Firstly, we have more leniency or chances to get the backstab. In this way, it's sort of similar to a parry cancel from Dark Souls 3, and it can be used in similar scenarios to the parry cancel. For example, if your opponent spins while healing or using a consumable, we can give ourselves a better chance to get a backstab while they're doing so. The other thing that we can do is, with particular movement and timing, we can actually angle our backstab grabs. Crucially, this will allow us to abuse the angle check and make for some really cool interactions. The idea behind this tech is that by angling my backstab grab to the side, I can make my backstab attempt go through successfully, even as someone turns to attack me. By standing slightly off to the right of my opponent, I can ensure that they will turn to the right when they lock on. Then, I can angle my backstab attempt to the right as well, so the angle at which they end up turning in relation to my backstab direction will not cause the angle check to fail. What I'm trying to show here with this graphic is how the angle check that happens for a backstab will be in relation to the direction my opponent's game sees me getting a backstab grab from, and I've done my best to add some lines to help illustrate roughly what I believe this looks like. From my testing, I've found that you want to use your consumable pretty much immediately out of hitstun level 1 attacks, and you want to take a step before using your consumable out of hitstun level 2 attacks, like the crouching R1 from a two-handed great spear. I actually found this tech after initially recording this video, but I think it's far too important to leave out, and why not include more new tech in this video? So I've come back to add this section for you all. I mention this as I'm sure there is more to explore with this tech, so I'm excited to see what other use cases people can find for this. One other niche fact about how backstabs work I want to mention is, recall from earlier in the video when I mentioned that inputting to turn around will instantly have you facing the other direction, and we simply see a smoothing animation playing. While that is true for making backstab angle checks fail, the backstab grab attempt area that the attacker sees will actually have smoothing, and follow based on what they see on their screen. So if they see your back at some point while you're turning, they will be able to get a backstab grab at that point, despite your inputted direction, as you can see based on these clips. I hope this helps to further your understanding of how backstabs work, and how someone may have gotten a backstab grab on you, despite you thinking that you never inputted to face away from your opponent. Now, back to parry stuff. If you have a sharp eye, you may have noticed something else going on in that previous clip related to parrying. Check out how landing a successful parry results in invulnerability from the host's attacks, as they swing right through without stunning or doing any damage. This is an interesting game mechanic which isn't obvious how it fundamentally functions under the hood. Despite my lack of understanding on how exactly this works, it's clear that parries can give you iframes. My assumption is that it happens after a player sees what they think is parryable frames lining up for a parry, and then that player parrying will get iframes. But if someone wants to look into this further to discover exactly how it works, I think it'd be quite interesting to find out, as this is certainly an instance of From Software code working in interesting ways. The reason why these iframes exist, I think, is probably for a couple of reasons. First, in order to help you somewhat consistently get ripostes after successful parries, and second, so that you don't take more stamina damage from multiple attacks if you time a parry correctly on one player and then another player attacks you. Regardless though, a pretty interesting niche feature that you may not have been aware of. One more interesting fact about parries before we transition back to some more backstab tech is that you can actually parry the jumping R1 attack from the Rakshasa Great Katana. Despite the fact that jump attacks cannot be parried, this specific attack actually can be parried, so if you ever see someone throwing some jump attacks out there with Rakshasa, then you just might be able to land a parry on it and blow your opponent's mind. Transitioning back, recall that you cannot get a backstab or be backstabbed immediately after jumping, due to a special effect that is added when landing. Well, knowing this, we can actually get around it by attacking in a jump, so that those specific landing transition animations are not played, and so that effect will not be applied to us, and we can get a backstab. This works in many situations where a normal jump would work well, such as against power stance grid spears. But you can also just throw them out there, and as long as you attack in the air, you will no longer restrict your potential of getting a backstab out of your jump. As you saw, they also work quite well when combined with a reverse jump, which is performed with the same process as reverse quickstep or bloodhound step, except we are jumping instead of using our Ash of War. In addition to reverse quicksteps, bloodhound steps, and reverse jumps, there are also other ashes and even spells you can do with reverse movement. Some are more useful than others, mainly due to when you are able to engage a backstab. You can reverse Miriam's Vanishing, for example, but you do need to do another action such as block out of the spell in order to get a backstab, or also get a queued normal R1 instead. Whereas with Dynastic Sickle Play on the Obsidian Lamina, you can actually grab a backstab right out of the Ash. Up next, I want to go over one final type of knockdown. There is one other way that players can be knocked down that is fairly common occurrence in PvP, falling from a ladder. I didn't put this type of knockdown in the previous section, as we are not actually able to grab a backstab directly out of this type of knockdown, but I would like to talk about how we can take advantage of this opportunity, as there are some interesting setups and combos we can do out of this knockdown. First off, let's understand how this knockdown works. If you knock someone off a ladder, then they will be put into a unique knockdown animation. Interestingly, you are actually vulnerable to attacks in this state, but you are locked into this animation for a significant amount of time before you're able to roll out. However, as soon as you attack someone when they're in this state, that will cancel them out of this vulnerable state. Something cool we can do to maximize our damage is to actually sleep our opponent out of this knockdown. Assuming that you don't delay your sleep pod significantly, then this is a guaranteed sleep out of the knockdown. Knowing this, you can set up some pretty crazy combos, especially if we leverage the transition into sleep by attacking at that time so we can get another crazy combo out of the sleep proc. The damage potential is pretty nuts. Finally, if they haven't died to your combo already, on top of this, you should have a pretty good chance to backstab a panic roll out of this combo, as your opponent probably has queued a roll trying to get out of the recovery at some point. With all this, you should have a pretty good chance of 100 to 0ing an opponent. These are just a few examples of true combos that you can do, so feel free to experiment and find more. Just keep in mind that when in sleep state, stun levels get upgraded, so if you do a stun level 1 attack, it will become level 2, 2 becomes 3, and level 3 will get upgraded to knock your opponent away immediately, which may not be ideal. Before getting into the final section of this video with counterfishing and mind games, I want to show one more visualization that is important for context when it comes to when you can and cannot get backstabs. In these clips, you can see the timing for when special effect 39 is applied, which recall prevents you from being able to get backstab grabs or another player to get a backstab grab on you. I think that is helpful to see a visual for how long this effect lasts out of a backstab and riposte, since when we play normally, this isn't apparent. The effect still lasts for 0.7 seconds, but notice the point at which it's applied. You can see that you can grab a backstab sooner out of a riposte than a backstab if your opponent doesn't attack. Just something to keep in mind. Alright, here we are, the final section of this video, counterfishing and mind games. Probably one of the most difficult things to explain and teach, but also what separates average fishers from those who are on that next level. So I'll do my best to talk about some of the things that you should think about when fishing to improve. But again, there are just so many potential situations, I can't possibly talk about them all, and it's something that will just come with a lot of experience. I will talk about a few potential situations though, to give an idea of what goes on in advanced fights and try to help fast track your progress. First things first, when it comes to counterfishing, we should understand a little bit more about the backstab grabs themselves. As previously mentioned, the backstab grabs in Elden Ring are quite punishable, more so than previous games. Therefore, it's important to know what we can do to reduce how punishable they are, by understanding their cancel windows. Ideally, you don't want to whiff a backstab at all, and only be tactical when you go for them. Just because you can get a backstab grab on someone, doesn't mean that you should try to backstab them. If you recognize that going for the grab isn't likely going to result in a successful backstab, then you probably don't want to do it, since whiffing is so punishable. But understanding the cancel windows can be the difference between getting punished for a whiff or not. With the thrust backstab, there is 49 frames of recovery before you can cancel into move, 43 frames into guard or weapon switch, 40 frames with fast cancel Ash of War, and 36 with dodge. With the Colossal Sword type grab, you have 79 frames of recovery before you can cancel into movement, 64 frames into guard or weapon switch, 51 with a fast cancel Ash of War, and 47 with dodge. The other backstab grabs differ slightly, but for each case, the fastest way to cancel out is by dodging, and you can see that the difference is significant. Knowing this, your best chance to escape someone trying to counterfish you after whiffing a grab is to roll for the fastest cancel, and roll into them to make sure the angle check fails. This is the exact interaction that creates some counterfishing mind games. There are plenty of situations that you won't be able to cancel out of your backstab recovery fast enough with other cancel methods besides dodging, and you cannot react to the startup of someone engaging a backstab, so this creates a sort of 50-50. If you whiff your backstab and expect the other person to go for a counter stab immediately on you, then you can roll back in and towards them to escape. But if the other person predicts this, and thinks that they aren't going to be able to get their stab to go through before you're able to cancel out of the recovery, then they can wait and punish your roll instead. Pretty cool, right? Something as simple as punishing a whiffed backstab can be so much deeper than what you may have initially thought or seen on the surface. This is where things get really interesting with fishing, and it can be expanded on even more depending on the situation with what weapons are being used and the attacks each player has access to. For example, you could trap them with an Ash of War. Observe this example situation, where after I escape their initial grab, I can get my opponent into a really tricky situation. If I go for a backstab on them, they need to roll in if they want to be able to escape. But I can bait going for the backstab and instead use my Storm Stomp to catch their roll. If they predict the Storm Stomp instead, they can escape by rolling away. But if they predict incorrectly, they'll get backstabbed. So this is what I mean by creating a 50-50. There are essentially two different actions I can take, and two different actions my opponent can take. It's up to my opponent to predict what I'll do correctly, or get punished. These are the mind games. Outside of counterfishing, just knowing when you should actually try for the backstab, and when you should let it be and wait for the roll catch BS, or just attack them, is a key aspect of fishing effectively against any player. It comes down to judging and knowing the attacks, and how long of recovery they have. Recognizing when you don't have enough time to get the BS, due to many attacks having low recovery in Elden Ring. If you think that they're going to try to panic roll, or you know you aren't going to be able to get to their back in time, it's often a good idea to just go for the inescapable on their roll, instead of on the attack recovery itself. You need to decide in your head whether or not they are still going to be locked into recovery by the time you get to them and engage your backstab, or not, and if it's worth going for. Another random piece of info that is relevant for fishing I want to throw in here, is that players will often panic roll in twos. This is sort of similar to players rolling in the direction that they have been moving, and it's just another thing I've noticed with many hours of experience. When trying to escape pressure, it's very often 2 quick rolls, and then at least a slight pause or a turn and burn attack. But of course this isn't guaranteed. I mention this however, as it's a key part of pattern recognition, which I want to talk about next. Educated guesses or predictions and good reads are key, so recognizing when players are falling into certain common habits or patterns like this is important, as it allows you to punish their specific playstyle. Closely intertwined with pattern recognition is conditioning people. Conditioning players is about forcing them into a particular, predictable pattern that you can exploit. Usually, it's about making them think doing something is helpful or safe and is going to help them, but in reality, you're luring them into a false sense of security. You're tossing the bait out there, and eventually, when you're ready, let them take the bait, and then bam, catch them off guard. Fishing. Let your opponent think that something predictable is going to happen in a sequence, and then switch it up. That's what fishing is fundamentally at its core. Some real applicable examples of this would be baiting your opponent to roll in with attacks that cannot be easily reacted to. For example, when using power stance great spears, you can condition your opponent to roll in. If you attack with a crouch L1 again after landing your first crouch L1 a couple of times, and your opponent realizes that they can roll in to make you miss, then you could hit your first crouch L1, and then crouch in their face to make them think that you're going to do another crouch attack, but don't attack this time, and punish their roll in with a backstab instead. Bam, Mog stab them. This is a sequence that works quite frequently with a variety of setups if you condition your opponents properly. Sometimes an attack isn't even necessary. If you have a good read on your opponent, you may even be able to bait them with movement. Something like a bundle stall, for example. Another example of conditioning might be that if you realize your pivot backstabs, running strafe backstabs, or roll backstabs are not going through against someone, against their colossal R1s let's say, then this would be a good time to try for a roll catch backstab or inescapable, because they are now conditioned to roll away thinking that you're going to go for a backstab immediately and need to roll in order to get away. One final random fact I have for you is related to poise events. These are sort of related to perfect blocks, as perfect blocks also cause a poise event, but there are several other ways to trigger poise events. At roughly the bottom of your crouch, you get a poise event where you will not be stunned by an incoming attack connecting with you at that time. This is a pretty cool tech if you intentionally use it to get a backstab, but not super practical, as just perfect blocking would usually be the preferred method to poise an incoming attack. The last advanced strategy I want to share is how you can counterfish players who aren't even going for backstabs. There's a way that we can set up so we can intentionally let our opponent get a backstab grab on us, and then punish their grab. This is effective anytime you recognize your opponent tends to mash R1 out of hit stun. By backstepping into your opponent after stunning them with an attack, if they press R1 at some point during the stun, then they will get a queued backstab grab on you. So, by immediately turning back around to face them after your reverse backstab, you can cause their backstab attempt to fail, and then backstab them yourself. Alternatively, you can also set this up by turning around to show your back to your opponent, and then turning back with some attacks. This tactic of forcing your opponent to whiff a backstab grab on you tends to work best with hit stun level 2 attacks from my testing. So there you have it. I hope that the content in this video has helped you to become better at getting crits, and you learned a thing or two. Now, I know that I said this guide would be comprehensive, but after recording all this, I realized that there are still a couple of things related to fishing that I didn't cover in this video. However, I wanted to get this video out to you all and not have it be 5 hours long. Those things being inventory management and swapping. Inventory management, or how you organize your inventory, greatly affects your gameplay and the options that you have for forcing certain behavior out of your opponents, catching them off guard, and the utility that you have readily available. There's a lot to consider when designing an inventory, and it's something that may not seem so important initially, especially for newer players, but it's really crucial for optimizing builds and taking your gameplay to the next level. Swapping is another thing that is often seen paired with the fishing playstyle, which can be seen as flashy and stylish, but navigating your menus quickly and efficiently, swapping at the correct times, can make the difference between winning and losing a fight. There are lots of little tips and tricks that I have for each of these things, and I realized that each of these topics could be a 20+ minute video on their own, so I've decided to leave them out. Additionally, I wanted to gauge interest to see if that's something that people would even be interested in seeing. So, if you'd be interested in seeing how I design my inventories, or tips on swapping and menu navigation, please let me know in the comments below. With that being said, I hope that you found this video helpful, and thanks for watching.
Yeah. Really good. should live here. Yeah.
Should have worked. I'll take it. Ooh, nice. GG, sir.